"Do what you want with me, but don't touch her," the poor farmer growled, pulling her into his arms. The August sun blazed mercilessly across the Kansas territory, its heat shimmering off the endless expanse of prairie grass that stretched toward the horizon like a golden sea. The air hung thick and still, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind that carried the scent of dried earth and distant wildflowers. Ezra Whitmore paused in his work, straightening his aching back as he watched three riders emerge from the heat haze, their silhouettes dark against the wavering landscape. From where he stood beside the wooden fence he had been mending, Ezra could see his modest homestead spread out before him like a testament to years of back-breaking labor. The cabin he and his father had built with their own hands sat sturdy and weathered against the rolling hills, its chimney sending a thin stream of smoke into the cloudless sky. The barn, patched and repatched over the years, housed their few head of cattle and the horses that meant the difference between survival and failure in this harsh land. Beyond that, row upon row of corn stretched toward the creek that meandered through their property, the stalks heavy with the promise of a good harvest. Ezra wiped the sweat from his brow with a calloused hand, his weathered fingers testament to 28 years of wrestling a living from unforgiving soil. His father had claimed this land when Ezra was barely old enough to hold a plow, and together they had transformed raw prairie into something that resembled civilization. When consumption had finally claimed the elder Whitmore 3 winters past, Ezra had inherited not just the land, but the crushing weight of responsibility that came with it. Through the cabin's single window, framed by curtains that hadn't been there 6 months ago, he could see Clara moving about the kitchen with the graceful efficiency that still surprised him. Her auburn hair caught the afternoon light as she worked, pinned back in a simple style that somehow managed to look elegant despite their humble surroundings. She wore the blue calico dress he had bought for her in town just last month, its color bringing out the green of her eyes in a way that never failed to make his breath catch. Clara Ashworth had arrived in their lives 3 months ago, on a night when thunder rolled across the prairie like the voice of an angry god. Ezra and his 19-year-old brother Samuel had been checking on the animals when they heard the distant sound of gunfire echoing across the darkness. By the time they reached the smoking remains of the wagon train 20 miles south, most of the damage had been done. Raiders, probably the same band that had been terrorizing settlers throughout the territory, had struck like wolves in the night. They found Clara half buried beneath the wreckage of an overturned wagon, clutching a silver locket and mumbling prayers through lips cracked and bleeding. Her traveling dress, once fine enough for an Eastern drawing room, was torn and stained with blood and prairie dust. For 3 days, she had lain unconscious in their crude cabin while Ezra and Samuel took turns watching over her, spooning water between her lips and changing the bandages on her wounds. When she finally opened her eyes, green as spring grass after rain, the first word she spoke was please. Not help, not water, not even her own name, but please, as if she expected even these rough frontier men to cause her harm. It had taken weeks for her to stop flinching when either of them moved too quickly, weeks more before she would venture outside the cabin without looking over her shoulder. The story she had told them then was simple enough. She was traveling west with her family, hoping to start a new life in California. The raiders had killed everyone else, and she alone had survived by playing dead among the wreckage. It was a tale that fit the evidence, and neither Ezra nor Samuel had reason to question it. Dozens of wagon trains had been attacked that year, and Clara was far from the first survivor they had heard of. But as the weeks passed and Clara's strength returned, Ezra began to notice things that didn't quite match her story. The way she moved with unconscious grace, as if she had been trained to walk and sit and hold herself in a manner befitting a lady of quality. The careful way she spoke, her words carrying the educated accent of someone who had been schooled far from the frontier. Most tellingly, there was the locket she wore always around her neck, its sapphire catching the light with a fire that spoke of considerable value. It was only last week that Clara had finally told him the truth, and the real story was far more complicated than either he or Samuel had imagined. She hadn't been traveling with family at all, but fleeing from a husband who had made her life a living nightmare. Theodore Ashworth was a railroad baron from Chicago, a man whose wealth and connections had given him the power to do whatever he pleased behind the closed doors of his mansion. What pleased him, Clara had discovered too late, was to use his fists on a wife who dared to question his decisions or express opinions of her own. The locket had belonged to her mother, the only thing of real value she had managed to take when she fled Chicago in the middle of the night. She had bought passage on the wagon train using the last of her own money she had hidden away coin by coin over months of planning her escape. The attack had been random, terrible luck that had nearly cost her everything, including her life. Now, watching the three riders approach with the deliberate pace of men who knew exactly where they were going, Ezra felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. He had been expecting this day ever since Clara's confession, dreading it while simultaneously trying to prepare for it. A woman like Clara, with her beauty and refinement, couldn't simply disappear without someone eventually coming to look for her. The lead rider dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who spent more time in the saddle than on solid ground. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, his silver hair neatly trimmed beneath a black hat that had seen better days. His clothes were well made but dusty from travel, and he carried himself with the confident air of someone accustomed to getting his way through a combination of charm and implied threat. His two companions remained mounted, their hands resting casually but deliberately near their holstered weapons. "Afternoon," the silver-haired man called out, his voice carrying the slight rasp of too many cigars and too much whiskey. "Name's Curtis Blackwood. I represent certain business interests back east, and I'm looking for someone who I believe might have found shelter here." Ezra set down his hammer and walked slowly toward the group, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. Behind him, he could hear the cabin door creak open as Samuel emerged, drawn by the sound of unfamiliar voices. The younger Whitmore brother had the same sturdy build as Ezra, but none of his older brother's hard-earned caution. At 19, Samuel still believed that most problems could be solved with honest work and good intentions. "I don't know what you're talking about," Ezra replied, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "There's no one here but my brother and me, and we're not in the habit of sheltering anyone we don't know." Blackwood smiled, but the expression held no warmth, reminding Ezra uncomfortably of a snake preparing to strike. "Now, Mr. Whitmore, yes, I know exactly who you are. We both know that's not entirely truthful. Mrs. Clara Ashworth has been missing from her home in Chicago for over 4 months now, and her husband is quite anxious to have her returned to where she belongs. He's authorized me to offer a substantial reward for information leading to her safe recovery." The words hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, acrid and dangerous. Ezra kept his expression carefully neutral, but inside his mind was racing. How much did this man know? How long had they been tracking Clara? And most importantly, what lengths would Theodore Ashworth go to in order to reclaim his runaway wife? "Ezra, what's going on?" Samuel's voice carried a note of confusion as he approached, his young face creased with concern. Despite his size and strength, Samuel had always been the gentler of the two brothers, quick to trust and slow to see danger until it was almost too late. "Nothing that concerns you, Sam. Go back inside and see to the evening chores." But even as Ezra spoke the words, he knew it was too late. The cabin door opened again, and Clara appeared in the frame, her green eyes wide with a fear that she couldn't quite hide despite her efforts to appear calm. She wore the simple blue dress that Ezra had bought for her in town, and despite everything she had endured, she still carried herself with the unconscious grace of a woman who had once moved in very different circles. For a moment that seemed to stretch like taffy, Nobody spoke. Clara's eyes met Blackwood's, and Ezra saw her face go pale as winter moonlight. Her hand moved instinctively to the locket at her throat, fingers closing around the familiar comfort of her mother's memory. "Mrs. Clara Ashworth," Blackwood said finally, removing his hat with mock courtesy, "your husband sends his warmest regards. He's been quite worried about you, as you might imagine. Quite worried indeed." "I'll bet he has," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a steel core that surprised even Ezra. Worried that someone might learn the truth about what kind of man he really is. Worried that his precious reputation might suffer if word got out about how he treats his wife. Blackwood's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold as January ice. Now, Mrs. Ashworth, let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. Whatever misunderstandings you may have had with your husband, they can certainly be resolved once you return home. Mr. Ashworth is a reasonable man, and I'm sure he's willing to forgive this little adventure of yours." "Adventure?" Clara's voice rose slightly, and Ezra could see her hands trembling despite her efforts to remain composed. "Is that what he's calling it, an adventure? What I'm calling it," Blackwood replied, his tone becoming noticeably less friendly, "is theft. You see, Mrs. Ashworth, you took something that doesn't belong to you when you left Chicago so abruptly. Something quite valuable that your husband is very eager to have returned." Clara's hand moved to the locket at her throat, her fingers closing protectively around the familiar weight. "This belonged to my mother. Theodore has no right to it. I'm afraid the law might see things differently, ma'am. According to the marriage contract you signed, all property acquired during the union, including gifts and inheritances, becomes the legal property of the husband. That rather expensive sapphire necklace you're wearing represents a considerable sum of money." Ezra felt anger rising in his chest like heat from a forge. He had heard enough stories of Eastern laws that favored wealthy men over everyone else, but seeing those laws used as a weapon against someone as vulnerable as Clara made his blood boil. "She's under my protection now," he said, stepping forward to position himself between Clara and the bounty hunters. "If you want to take her anywhere, you'll have to go through me first." Blackwood chuckled, a sound like dried leaves rattling in the wind. "Mr. Whitmore, I admire your gallantry. Truly, I do. But you're just a dirt farmer trying to scratch a living from this God-forsaken prairie. Mr. Theodore Ashworth is one of the most powerful men in Chicago, with business interests stretching all the way to Washington, D.C. He could have this entire territory condemned as unsuitable for agricultural development if he chose to do so. You'd lose everything: your land, your home, your livelihood, everything your family has worked for over the years." The threat settled over them like dust after a stampede, coating everything with the gritty reality of power and money. Ezra knew the man wasn't bluffing. He had heard stories of wealthy Eastern industrialists who could buy and sell entire counties without breaking a sweat, men who treated the lives of common folk like pieces on a chessboard to be moved or swept away as convenient. But as he looked back at Clara, seeing the fear in her eyes, but also the desperate hope that someone finally might stand up for her against the forces that had controlled and tormented her for so long, Ezra knew he couldn't back down. These past months had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Having Clara in their home had transformed the crude cabin from a shelter into something that felt like a real home for the first time since his mother's death. It wasn't just the small touches she had added: the curtains at the windows, the wildflowers in a mason jar on the table, the way she had organized their few possessions to make the most of their limited space. It was the way she hummed while she worked, the sound floating through the cabin like a promise that life could hold more than just endless labor and loneliness. It was the way she listened when he talked about his plans for expanding the farm, offering suggestions that revealed an intelligence and education that had been wasted in Theodore Ashworth's house of cruelty. Most of all, it was the way she had slowly, carefully allowed herself to trust them, the way she had stopped flinching when Samuel laughed too loudly or when Ezra moved too quickly, the way she had begun to smile, really smile, when she thought no one was watching. The way she had started to look at their rough cabin as if it might actually be a place where she could belong. "Do what you want with me," Ezra growled, reaching out to pull Clara into his arms, feeling her slight form trembling against his chest. "But don't touch her." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise everyone else. He had grown fond of Clara over the past months, certainly. He had come to appreciate her quiet strength, her gentle humor, her way of making even their simple meals feel like something special. But holding her now, feeling her lean into his strength and protection, feeling the way she fit against him as if she had been made to rest there, he realized his feelings ran far deeper than mere fondness. Somewhere between the long evenings when she had helped him with the account books, her educated mind grasping numbers and calculations that had always given him trouble, and the quiet mornings when he would find her on the porch watching the sunrise with a cup of coffee in her hands, he had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with her. Blackwood's expression hardened like clay left too long in the sun. "I was hoping we could handle this like civilized men, Mr. Whitmore, but if you insist on making this personal..." He nodded to his companions, who began to dismount with movements that spoke of men accustomed to violence. "Wait," Clara said, stepping out of Ezra's protective embrace despite his attempt to keep her close. "Please, just wait." She looked at Ezra with eyes that held years of pain, but also a fierce determination that he had never seen before. "I'll go with you, Mr. Blackwood. Just promise me you won't hurt these men. They've done nothing wrong except show Christian kindness to a stranger in need." "Clara, no," Ezra said firmly, reaching for her again. "You don't have to go back to that life. You don't have to go back to him." "What choice do I have?" she asked, and now the tears she had been holding back began to spill down her cheeks. "If I stay here, Theodore will destroy you and Samuel. He'll take your land, your home, everything you've worked for since you were children. I won't be responsible for that. I won't let my problems ruin the lives of the only people who've shown me genuine kindness in years." Samuel, who had been listening to the exchange with growing understanding and anger, suddenly spoke up. "Maybe there's another way." All eyes turned to the young man, who was looking at Clara with an expression that mixed shy admiration with determined courage. Ezra recognized that look all too well. His brother had also fallen under Clara's spell, though in Samuel's case it was the innocent infatuation of a young man who had rarely been in the presence of a woman of Clara's refinement and grace. "What do you mean, Sam?" Clara asked gently, her voice carrying the same kindness she had always shown to the younger Whitmore brother. "Well," Samuel said, his face reddening with embarrassment but his voice growing stronger as he spoke, "if you were married to someone else, legally married, I mean, then Theodore couldn't claim you as his wife anymore, could he? I mean, the law would have to recognize the new marriage, wouldn't it?" Blackwood laughed, but there was less confidence in the sound than before. "The boy has a point, I'll give him that. But it would have to be a legitimate marriage, properly witnessed and recorded with the territorial authorities. And besides," he added, his tone becoming mocking, "what man would be willing to marry a woman with such complications attached to her name?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Ezra looked at Clara, seeing his own desperate thoughts reflected in her green eyes. It was a wild plan, born of desperation and hope in equal measure, but it might be the only chance they had to keep her safe from the nightmare she had fled. More than that, though, it was a chance to make real what had been growing between them these past months, the quiet conversations over coffee that had stretched late into the evening, the way she had helped him plan improvements to the farm, her suggestions revealing both practical wisdom and genuine investment in their future. The moments when their hands had touched while working side by side, sending sparks through him that had nothing to do with static electricity and everything to do with the woman herself. "I would," Ezra said quietly, his voice carrying across the yard with the weight of absolute certainty. The silence that followed was so complete that Ezra could hear the distant sound of their cattle moving restlessly in the pasture and the creak of the windmill as it turned in the barely perceptible breeze. Clara stared at him with amazement written across her features, her lips parted as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. "Ezra," she whispered finally, her voice so soft he had to strain to hear it. "You don't know what you're saying. You don't understand what it would mean, what kind of danger you'd be putting yourself in. Theodore isn't the kind of man who accepts defeat gracefully." "I know exactly what I'm saying," he replied, closing the distance between them and taking her hands in his work-roughened ones. "Clara, these past 3 months, having you here has changed everything for me. This place was just a house before, just a place to sleep between days of work. You made it a home. You made it feel like a place worth fighting for." He paused, searching for words to express feelings he had never spoken aloud before. "I should have told you sooner how I felt, but I was afraid you'd think I was taking advantage of your situation. Afraid you'd think I was no better than—" He couldn't bring himself to say Theodore's name. "Oh, Ezra," Clara breathed, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks, but these were different tears than before. "You could never be like him, never. You've shown me what a good man looks like, what kindness looks like. You've given me back my faith in the possibility that life can be gentle instead of cruel." "This is very touching," Blackwood interrupted, his voice cutting through the moment like a blade. "But you're both forgetting something important. Mr. Ashworth isn't going to simply accept defeat because his runaway wife has found herself a new husband. He'll challenge this marriage in every court from here to Washington, and he has the money to make it a very long, very expensive battle." "Can you afford that kind of legal fight, Mr. Whitmore?" The question struck at the heart of Ezra's deepest fears. Legal battles were expensive, and he was far from a wealthy man. The farm provided a living, but barely more than that. A prolonged court fight could bankrupt them, leave them homeless and destitute. But as he looked at Clara's face, seeing the hope and fear warring in her expression, he knew he couldn't let money be the deciding factor. "Then we'll fight," Ezra said simply. "Samuel's right about the law. If Clara and I are legally married, Theodore has no claim on her. As for the courts—" He shrugged with more confidence than he felt. "Let him try. This isn't Chicago, and territorial judges don't always dance to the tune of Eastern money. And as for this," Clara said, reaching behind her neck to unfasten the chain that held her mother's locket. Her hands shook as she held the necklace out to Blackwood, the sapphire catching the late afternoon light like captured sky. "Tell Theodore he can have this back. It was never about the money anyway. It was about keeping something of my mother close to my heart, but—" She looked at Ezra with eyes that held a lifetime of love. "I found something better to keep close to my heart now." Blackwood took the necklace, examining the sapphire with a practiced eye that spoke of experience in evaluating valuable items. "This will satisfy part of Mr. Ashworth's demands," he admitted grudgingly. "But don't think this is over. Theodore Ashworth doesn't like to lose, especially not to—" He looked around at their modest homestead with obvious disdain. "Well, especially not to people like you." "Neither do I," Ezra replied evenly, his arm tightening protectively around Clara's waist. As the 3 riders disappeared back into the heat haze from which they had emerged, their forms growing smaller and smaller until they were swallowed entirely by the shimmering prairie, Ezra felt both relief and apprehension settle over him like a heavy blanket. They had won this battle, but Blackwood's parting words made it clear that the war was far from over. Clara stood beside him in the gathering dusk, her hand clasped tightly in his, watching the last traces of dust settle back to the earth. The evening air was beginning to cool, carrying with it the sounds of their small world, continuing its ancient rhythms. The distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the windmill, the whisper of wind through the prairie grass. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the evening sounds. "Marriage is a sacred thing, Ezra. I don't want you to feel obligated to protect me this way if your heart isn't truly in it. The only thing I feel obligated to do," he replied, turning to face her fully in the dying light, "is to tell you the complete truth. I love you, Clara Ashworth. I have for weeks now, maybe since that first night when I found you in the wreckage and you looked at me like I was an angel instead of just a man covered in dirt and sweat and smelling like horses." He paused, gathering courage for words that would change both their lives forever. "If you'll have me, not just as protection from Theodore, but as a husband who will cherish and respect and love you for the rest of our days together, then I'm asking you properly now, the way you deserve to be asked. Clara, will you marry me?" Her answer was a kiss, soft and sweet, and filled with all the emotions she had been keeping locked away in her heart, for fear they might be unwelcome. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Samuel was standing on the porch grinning, despite the tears shining in his eyes. "I guess I better ride to town first thing in the morning and fetch Preacher Williams," he said, his young voice cracking slightly with emotion. "Can't have a proper wedding without a proper preacher, and if we're going to do this, we might as well do it right." The wedding took place 3 days later in the small wooden church that served the growing community, with Samuel standing proud as his brother's best man and Mrs. Williams, the preacher's wife, serving as Clara's matron of honor. Clara wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in tissue paper at the bottom of her traveling trunk. A gown of ivory silk that had been fashionable in Chicago society, but looked timelessly beautiful in the simple frontier church. Ezra had spent his last silver dollar on a simple gold band from Miller's General Store and had borrowed Samuel's best shirt for the occasion. His hands shook slightly as he slipped the ring onto Clara's finger, but his voice was steady and sure as he spoke the vows that would bind them together for the rest of their lives. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, conducted in the presence of nearly the entire community, people who had come to know and respect both Ezra and Clara in the months since her arrival. When Preacher Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Ezra kissed his bride with a tenderness that made more than one woman in the congregation reach for her handkerchief. As they walked out of the church together into the bright Kansas sunshine, Clara's hand tucked securely into the crook of Ezra's arm, they were showered with rice and good wishes from neighbors who had become like family. For the first time since she had fled Chicago in the dead of night, Clara felt truly safe, truly protected, and truly home. If this story has touched your heart so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with friends who love Old West stories. The months that followed their wedding were not without their challenges, as Blackwood's warning proved prophetic. True to his nature, Theodore Ashworth did not accept defeat gracefully. Within weeks of the marriage, papers began arriving from Chicago lawyers, challenging the validity of the ceremony on various technical grounds. Private investigators appeared in town, asking questions and offering money for information about the illegal marriage of Theodore Ashworth's missing wife. The legal assault was relentless and expensive. Ezra found himself forced to hire a lawyer from the territorial capital, an expense that strained their modest resources to the breaking point. There were depositions to give, documents to file, witnesses to locate and interview. For a time, it seemed as though Theodore's superior resources and connections might succeed in having the marriage annulled. But Ezra and Clara had allies they hadn't fully appreciated, the tight-knit community of settlers who had come to know and respect them both. Mrs. Williams organized the women of the town to write testimonial letters about Clara's character and her contributions to their small community. The local judge, a former Union officer named Marcus Reed, who had little patience for Eastern money trying to buy Western justice, made it clear that as far as his court was concerned, Clara Whitmore was exactly where she belonged. Through it all, Ezra and Clara's relationship deepened and flourished in ways that surprised them both. What had begun as a marriage of protection and convenience quickly evolved into something genuine and profound. They learned each other's habits and preferences, shared their deepest fears and most cherished dreams, and slowly built the kind of partnership that made them stronger together than either could ever be alone. Clara proved to be not just a skilled homemaker, but also a shrewd businesswoman whose education and refinement found perfect expression in helping Ezra expand their modest operation. She convinced him to diversify beyond simple grain crops, and soon they were raising vegetables for the growing town market and even experimenting with fruit trees that might thrive in the Kansas climate. Her knowledge of numbers and bookkeeping, skills that had been considered merely decorative accomplishments in Theodore's world, proved invaluable in managing their expanding business. She established relationships with merchants in nearby towns, negotiating prices and terms that maximized their profits while building a reputation for reliability and quality. Samuel, meanwhile, had discovered an unexpected talent for working with horses. What had started as a simple necessity, they needed good horses for farm work and transportation, had developed into a profitable side business as word spread throughout the territory about the quality of the animals he trained. His gentle touch and intuitive understanding of horse psychology produced mounts that were not only strong and reliable, but also unusually responsive to their riders. It was during the harvest season of their first year as a married couple that the final confrontation came. Theodore Ashworth himself arrived in town, not with bounty hunters this time, but with a small army of hired guns and a briefcase full of legal papers claiming ownership of the Whitmore farm through some obscure territorial statute that his lawyers had unearthed. Ezra was in the fields, supervising the harvest of their best corn crop ever, when Samuel came riding hard across the prairie with news that would change everything. Clara was in town at the general store, thankfully away from immediate danger, but Samuel's report of armed men and legal threats sent ice through Ezra's veins. The three men, Ezra, Samuel, and their hired hand Pete Martinez, met at the house as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red that seemed to match the fire burning in Ezra's eyes. Pete, a veteran of the Mexican War who had settled in Kansas after his service, quietly checked his rifle and offered to ride for the sheriff, but Ezra shook his head. "He can't just take our land," Samuel said, pacing back and forth across the wooden porch their father had built with his own hands. "We've got the deed, properly filed and recorded with the territorial government. This is our home." "Legal papers can be challenged," Ezra replied grimly, his mind working through possibilities and strategies, especially when you've got enough money to buy the right judges and the right witnesses. Theodore Ashworth didn't become one of the richest men in Chicago by accepting defeat when things didn't go his way. The question is, what are we going to do about it? The answer came from an unexpected source. Clara returned home just as full darkness was settling over the prairie, but she wasn't alone. Behind her came what seemed like half the town, farmers and shopkeepers, the blacksmith and the doctor, even some of the women with their husbands' rifles in their hands. Nearly every able-bodied adult from the community had answered Clara's desperate plea for help. "I told them everything," she explained as she dismounted from her horse, her face flushed from the hard ride, but her voice steady with determination. "About Theodore, about his threats, about what kind of man he really is, about what he's trying to do to our family, to our home." Sheriff Marcus Reed, a grizzled veteran of both the Civil War and numerous frontier disputes, stepped forward from the crowd. His weathered face was grim but determined, and the badge on his vest caught the light from the cabin's windows. "Ezra, I've known your family since your father first claimed this land. He was a good man who earned his place here through honest work and fair dealing. You've proven yourself to be cut from the same cloth." The sheriff paused, looking around at the assembled crowd of neighbors and friends. "If this eastern dandy thinks he can ride into my territory with his hired guns and start throwing his weight around, trying to steal land from decent folks who've earned their place here, then he's got another think coming." What followed the next morning was not the violent confrontation that everyone had feared, but something far more devastating to a man like Theodore Ashworth. Complete and utter rejection by an entire community united in purpose. When he arrived with his small army of gunmen and his briefcase full of legal documents, he found not just the Whitmores waiting for him, but nearly 60 armed and determined settlers who had decided they'd had enough of outside interference in their affairs. Theodore Ashworth was everything Clara had described and worse. A soft-bodied man in expensive clothes, whose pale hands had never known honest work, whose cold eyes held the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to buying and selling human lives as easily as livestock. He surveyed the crowd of farmers and townspeople with obvious disdain, as if their very presence offended his refined sensibilities. "This is highly irregular," he announced, his cultured Chicago accent sounding foreign and unwelcome in the Kansas morning air. "I have legal documents here that clearly establish my claim to this property, and I don't intend to be intimidated by a mob of farmers." The legal papers he produced were met with polite but absolutely firm refusal. Judge Reed examined them carefully, his experience as a territorial magistrate allowing him to identify the weaknesses and questionable interpretations that Theodore's lawyers had used to construct their case. The threats of financial ruin and political pressure were countered with quiet offers to escort Theodore and his hired guns to the territorial border immediately. Most humiliating of all for a man accustomed to having his every wish treated as a command, Clara faced him not as the cowering, frightened victim he remembered, but as a woman who had found her strength and her place in the world. She stood beside her husband, her hand clasped firmly in his, and met Theodore's furious gaze without flinching. "You never understood," she told him, her voice carrying clearly across the yard so that everyone present could hear, "that I never wanted your money or your grand house or your position in Chicago society. All I ever wanted was to be treated with basic human decency, to be valued for more than just my ability to make you look respectable at your business dinners." She gestured to the crowd of friends and neighbors surrounding her, people who had risked their own safety to stand with her against Theodore's threats. "These people gave me that freely, without conditions or expectations beyond simple human kindness. That's something you never could understand, something your money could never buy." Theodore Ashworth left Kansas that day and never returned, his hired guns trailing behind him like beaten dogs. The legal challenges continued for several more months, with papers flying back and forth between Chicago and the territorial capital. But without his physical presence to intimidate witnesses and bribe officials, his case gradually fell apart. Eventually, even his most expensive lawyers admitted defeat and advised their client to pursue other interests. The victory came at a cost. The legal fees and lost work time had strained their finances severely, but the community that had rallied to their defense continued to support them through the difficult period. Neighbors helped with the harvest when court appearances kept Ezra away from the farm. The women of the town organized quilting bees and baking circles that ensured Clara never felt isolated or alone. The bonds forged during that crisis would last for decades, creating a network of mutual support that made their little corner of Kansas feel truly like home. 5 years later, as Ezra stood on the porch of their expanded house, watching Clara hang laundry in the yard while their 3-year-old daughter Emma chased chickens around the garden, and their infant son James slept peacefully in his wooden cradle, he marveled at how much their lives had changed. The modest cabin had grown into a proper farmhouse with real glass windows and a separate kitchen that Clara had designed herself. Samuel had married Mary Williams, the preacher's daughter, 2 years earlier, and had built his own house on the far side of their property. His horse training business had grown so successful that buyers came from 3 states away to purchase his animals. The brothers had formalized their partnership, with Samuel handling the livestock while Ezra focused on crops and the business side of their expanding operation. The farm itself had prospered beyond their wildest early dreams. Clara's suggestions about diversifying their crops had proven brilliant. Their vegetables were in high demand in the growing towns throughout the territory, and the fruit trees she had insisted on planting were finally beginning to produce. They had even begun experimenting with raising sheep, whose wool could be sold to textile mills back east. But more important than their financial success was the way their marriage had grown and deepened over the years. They had learned to love not just each other's strengths, but also each other's weaknesses and flaws. Clara's occasional bouts of melancholy, especially around the anniversary of her mother's death, no longer frightened Ezra as they once had. Instead, he had learned to recognize the signs and respond with gentle patience, holding her close while she grieved for the family she had lost and the innocence that Theodore's cruelty had stolen from her. Similarly, Clara had learned to navigate Ezra's stubborn pride, the way he sometimes drove himself too hard, trying to prove he could provide for his family without help from anyone. She had developed a gift for making suggestions that allowed him to save face while accepting the support he actually needed, whether it came from neighbors offering to help with a difficult harvest or her own quiet contributions to their financial planning. Their children had brought new dimensions to their love. Watching Emma toddle after her father through the fields while chattering in the mixture of English and Spanish she had picked up from Pete Martinez, or seeing James's face light up whenever Clara sang to him in the evenings. The lullabies she had learned from her own mother, songs that had survived the nightmare of her first marriage, to become gifts she could pass on to her children. The evening ritual had become sacred to both of them. After the children were settled for the night, Ezra and Clara would sit together on the porch, watching the sun paint the western sky in brilliant colors while they talked through the events of the day. Sometimes they planned improvements to the farm or discussed Emma's education. Other times they simply sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of their thriving homestead and the vast prairie beyond. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked one such evening, her head resting against Ezra's shoulder as they watched lightning bugs begin their nightly dance among the garden vegetables. "Taking such a tremendous risk for someone you barely knew, putting everything you had built at stake for a stranger." Ezra considered the question seriously, as he always did when Clara asked him something important. It was one of the things he loved most about her, the way she made him think deeply about his choices and motivations, helping him understand himself better than he ever had before. "The only thing I regret," he said finally, his arm tightening around her shoulders, "is that it took a crisis to make me realize what I felt for you. I should have had the courage to speak up sooner, to tell you how you had changed everything for me, even before Theodore's man showed up at our door." Perhaps," Clara replied thoughtfully, her fingers tracing patterns on his work-worn hand. "But then again, perhaps we both needed to go through everything we did to truly appreciate what we have now. I know I'm not the same frightened, broken woman who collapsed in your barn that terrible night." "No," Ezra agreed, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of the rosewater she made from the bushes she had planted beside the house. "You're not. You're stronger, braver, and more beautiful than I ever imagined anyone could be. You're exactly the woman I needed, even when I didn't know I needed her." The conversation was interrupted by a cry from inside the house. James, waking from his nap and demanding attention with the imperious wail of a 6-month-old who was accustomed to having his needs met promptly. Clara rose to tend to him, but not before giving Ezra a kiss that still had the power to make his heart race after all these years. As he watched her disappear into the warm glow of their home, Ezra reflected on the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. The wagon train attack that had seemed like such a tragedy had actually been the beginning of his real life. Theodore Ashworth's cruelty, which had driven Clara to flee into the dangerous unknown of the frontier, had inadvertently delivered to Ezra the greatest gift he had ever received. Even Blackwood's visit, as terrifying as it had been at the time, had forced them both to acknowledge feelings they might otherwise have been too cautious to explore. The threat of losing Clara had shown Ezra exactly how much she meant to him, while his willingness to risk everything for her protection had convinced Clara that not all men were driven by the desire to control and possess. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke into his reverie, and Ezra looked up to see Samuel riding toward the house, his face bright with excitement in the gathering dusk. Behind him rode a stranger, a well-dressed man on a fine horse, who carried himself with the bearing of someone important. "Ezra!" Samuel called out as he dismounted. "You're not going to believe this. This here is Mr. Jonathan Wheeler from the Kansas Pacific Railroad. He wants to talk to us about something that could change everything." Wheeler dismounted and approached the porch, removing his hat politely. He was a man of perhaps 40 years, with the kind of soft hands and pale complexion that marked him as someone who worked indoors. But his manner was far different from Theodore Ashworth's arrogant entitlement. This man carried himself with the confidence of success honestly earned. "Mr. Whitmore," Wheeler said, extending his hand, "I apologize for calling so late in the day, but I've been traveling through the territory evaluating potential routes for railroad expansion, and your property has caught my attention." Ezra shook the offered hand cautiously, years of dealing with Eastern businessmen having taught him to be wary of unexpected opportunities that seemed too good to be true. "What kind of attention, Mr. Wheeler?" "The kind that could make you a very wealthy man," Wheeler replied with a smile that seemed genuine. "The railroad is planning to extend a branch line through this area within the next 2 years, and your land sits directly on what we've determined is the most practical route. We're prepared to offer you a substantial sum for the right-of-way, plus a percentage of future freight revenues from crops shipped using our line." The offer was staggering. More money than Ezra had imagined seeing in his entire lifetime, enough to ensure that Emma and James would have opportunities he and Samuel had never dreamed of, enough to secure their family's future for generations to come. But it would also mean significant changes to their way of life, and Ezra had learned to be suspicious of anything that seemed too easy. "I'll need to discuss this with my wife," he said carefully. "And I'd want to see all the details in writing before making any decisions." "Of course," Wheeler agreed readily. "I wouldn't expect anything less from a careful businessman. I'll be staying in town for the rest of the week, if you'd like time to consider the proposal." After Wheeler had ridden back toward town, Ezra sat alone on the porch for a long time, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The railroad offer represented everything he had worked toward since taking over the farm from his father: financial security, prosperity, a legacy to leave his children. But it also represented change on a scale he wasn't sure he was ready for. Clara emerged from the house carrying a sleepy James, having finally gotten him settled back to sleep. She settled beside Ezra on the wooden bench he had built for their evening conversations, the baby content to doze in her arms. "Samuel told me about Mr. Wheeler's offer," she said softly. "It's quite generous." "More than generous," Ezra agreed. "It's life-changing money, Clara. With that kind of capital, we could expand the farm, maybe buy some of the neighboring sections that are coming up for sale, send Emma to a real school back east, maybe even college if she wants it." "All true," Clara said, but he could hear the thoughtful note in her voice that meant she was considering aspects of the situation he might have missed. "But it would also mean a railroad line running right through our property, with all the noise and disruption that would bring. And once the rail line is established, this whole area will start growing much faster. More settlers, more towns, more complications. She was right, of course. The railroad would bring prosperity, but it would also bring the kind of rapid development that could transform their quiet corner of Kansas into something they no longer recognized. The peace and solitude that had made their home feel like a sanctuary could disappear entirely. "What do you think we should do?" he asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Over the years, he had learned that Clara's education and experience with the wider world often gave her insights that his frontier upbringing had not provided. "I think," Clara said slowly, shifting James to a more comfortable position, "that we should consider what we really want our life to look like 10 years from now. Do we want to be wealthy landowners dealing with railroad schedules and freight contracts? Or do we want to be farmers who happen to have enough money to live comfortably and provide for our children's future?" It was a profound question, and one that cut to the heart of who they had become as individuals and as a couple. The farm, as it was, now reflected their values: hard work, self-reliance, community connection, and the satisfaction that came from building something lasting with their own hands. Wealth could provide security and opportunities, but it could also bring complications and pressures they had never had to navigate. They talked long into the night, weighing the possibilities and considering the implications from every angle they could imagine. By morning, they had reached a decision that surprised even them with its clarity and certainty. When Wheeler returned 3 days later, expecting to finalize the railroad deal, he found Ezra waiting for him with a counter-proposal that demonstrated exactly how much Clara's business acumen had influenced her husband's thinking. "We're willing to grant the right-of-way for the railroad," Ezra explained, "but we want to retain ownership of the land itself. Instead of selling, we'll lease the railroad corridor to your company for 50 years, with provisions for renegotiation at the end of that period. And instead of a lump sum payment, we want annual payments that will provide steady income without forcing us to manage a large amount of capital all at once." Wheeler was impressed despite himself. "That's a very sophisticated approach, Mr. Whitmore. Most farmers in your position would take the immediate payout." "It'd be most farmers in my position," Ezra replied with a slight smile, "don't have wives who understand contract law and long-term financial planning." The final agreement they reached was more complex than Wheeler's original offer, but ultimately more beneficial to both parties. The railroad got its right-of-way without having to manage property ownership in dozens of small parcels, while the Whitmores secured a steady income stream that would grow with the railroad's success without sacrificing their control over their family land. 2 years later, as the first locomotive rolled through their property carrying grain and livestock to markets back east, Ezra and Clara stood with their children watching the iron horse that would connect their isolated homestead to the wider world. Emma, now 5 years old, clapped her hands in delight at the sight of the massive engine, while 3-year-old James hid behind his mother's skirts until curiosity overcame his fear. The railroad brought changes, as Clara had predicted, but they proved to be largely positive ones. The improved transportation links made their farm products more valuable and easier to market. The growing town that sprang up around the railroad depot created new opportunities for Samuel's horse business and brought neighbors who shared their values of hard work and community cooperation. Most importantly, the steady income from the railroad lease had given them the financial security to make choices based on what would make them happy, rather than what was necessary for survival. Emma could attend the new school that had been built in town, learning from teachers who had been educated back east, while still helping with farm chores that would teach her the value of honest work. James was showing signs of inheriting his Uncle Samuel's gift with animals, spending hours in the barn, learning to gentle the young horses. On a warm evening in late summer, Exactly 7 years after that desperate moment when Ezra had pulled Clara into his arms and declared his protection over her, they sat together on their porch, watching their children play in the yard while the sun set behind the distant hills. The sounds of their thriving farm, lowing cattle, nickering horses, the distant whistle of the evening train, created a symphony of contentment that neither of them had ever expected to experience. "Do you know what I realized today?" Clara asked, leaning against her husband's shoulder in the familiar gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the years. "What's that?" Ezra replied, his arm automatically tightening around her in response to her movement. "Today marks 7 years since Blackwood rode up to our door and changed our lives forever. 7 years since you decided that protecting me was worth risking everything you had built." Ezra considered this, watching Emma show James how to throw corn to the chickens while their laughter floated across the yard like music. "You know what I realized? It wasn't really a risk at all. The real risk would have been letting you go, letting fear keep me from fighting for what I knew was right." "And what do you know now?" Clara asked softly. "I know," Ezra said, turning to look directly into the green eyes that still had the power to stop his breath, "that sometimes what looks like the most dangerous choice is actually the only safe one. I know that home isn't a place you live, it's the people you can't imagine living without. And I know that every challenge we've faced together has only made us stronger." As the stars began to appear in the darkening Kansas sky, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the evening sounds of their world, their children's laughter, the gentle sounds of livestock settling for the night, the distant call of a night bird across the prairie. It had been a long journey, from that desperate moment when strangers had threatened to tear apart the fragile sanctuary they had built together, but it had led them to exactly where they belonged. The story you've just heard is entirely fictional and created for the purpose of inspiration and entertainment, designed to remind us all of the power of love, courage, and community in overcoming life's greatest challenges. Our channel is dedicated to bringing you original stories that celebrate the human spirit and the timeless values of loyalty, sacrifice, and the kind of love that grows stronger through adversity, rather than weaker. If you've been moved by Ezra and Clara's journey from strangers brought together by crisis to partners who built a life of meaning and purpose together, please subscribe to our channel to discover more stories of hope and redemption. Like this video, if it touched your heart, leave a comment sharing your thoughts about the choices these characters made and how their story resonates with your own experiences, and share it with friends and family who appreciate tales of courage, second chances, and the transformative power of standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier love and the courage it takes to protect what matters most. We look forward to sharing many more heartwarming stories with you, tales that remind us that even in the harshest circumstances, love and determination can create something beautiful and lasting.